In the previous lecture, I pointed out how Ostia, although one of the earliest Roman colonies and one of the closest to Rome, developed a culture that differed in some very clear ways from the city of Rome itself, socially, religiously, and economically. In this lecture, we'll examine the Roman colony at Timgad, one of the latest Roman colonies, but one that culturally stayed very close to its Roman traditions. Timgad was a Roman colony on the edge of the Ares Mountains in modern Algeria. Founded as Colonia Marciana Ulpia Traiana Thamugadi, it's known today by its modern name Timgad, for which I am grateful. The city was excavated beginning in the late 19th century, and by that time the sands of the desert had covered and preserved the bottom 3 feet, or roughly the lowest meter of walls, as well as all the paved streets, colonnaded sidewalks, the forum, and the mosaic floors in particular, of which over 200 have been excavated and removed to the local museum called Museum Timgad. Now, Roman colonization is a product of the desire to occupy disputed or dangerous territory and of the patterns of Roman military discharge. Once a unit served and was discharged, the members of it would receive a cash bonus, land, and, for those who weren't citizens already, Roman citizenship for themselves and their immediate families. At this period, in the 2nd century AD, a large number of non-citizens served in the Roman army. Drawn from the edges of the Roman world and beyond, they provided critical manpower and skills to the military, and in fact served as larger and larger proportions of the army into the late Roman period. The grant of land was given in the form of a colony. The unit veterans were all settled together in this sort of community, often in frontier zones where they could serve as a buffer between Roman and barbarian territory. So, even in retirement, they served Rome by providing a sort of military presence in disputed areas. Now, this may seem like a raw deal for them. Fight for 20 years, and once you're retired, you serve as a speed bump to any invaders on the edges of the empire. That could be the case, but actually very few colonies were attacked. Most were placed on recently conquered territory because that was land no one, by which I mean no Roman, had claim on. There was space for them. The colonists did serve as a sort of national guard or local militia that could be called up to serve in a military capacity, but really were rarely called upon to do so. Now, Timgad was founded by the Roman Emperor Trajan in AD 100 as a military colony to settle 900 veterans and their families, putting the initial population at about, we think, 3,000 people. These were veterans of his Parthian campaign, Trajan's invasion of the great Parthian Empire, which was a tremendous military success. They all came from the 3rd Augustan Legion, and as part of their discharge benefits and a bulwark against raids of the rich Roman territory, or if travelers along the roads led to the coast in this area, they were planted here. Raids in this territory typically came from the tribes in the interior of Africa from across the mountains. So Timgad was built spanning a major road that led to one of the major passes across the mountains. Speed bump. The veterans of Timgad, many of whom were recent recipients of full Roman citizenship on their discharge, act in ways that show just how much they valued that citizenship and the link they had to Rome. In many ways, they seem to conduct their lives in a manner that's more Roman than the people in Rome. Now, this is a pattern I'm sure you've seen yourself among recent converts whose enthusiasm for whatever it is can sometimes be overwhelming. It's as though the people of Timgad are wearing buttons that read, "Ask me how I lost my non-citizen status." They want to appear only as Roman citizens. If for any Roman in the city of Rome itself, his or her Romanness was something that they could take for granted, on the frontier it was more crucial, as it gave a sense of security and of belonging to the wider Roman world, in stark contrast to the barbarian culture around them or just across the frontier zone. We're going to look first at the layout of the city of Timgad and then at its cultural identity. Now, Timgad is simply the best preserved example of Roman city planning that survives from anywhere in the Roman world. Period. Full stop. Unlike other colonies, Pompeii, for example, it was not founded on a previous city, but laid out on unoccupied ground. As such, it represents the ideal of Roman city planning. Now, before someone rolls their eyes and says, not orthogonal planning again, let me say, yes, orthogonal planning again. But actually, much more than that. Timgad preserves the Roman notion of what we term a parva Roma, a small Rome. That is, it's the ideal, a petrification of Rome, reflecting what the Romans would have built in Rome themselves had they planned it rather than, as the historian Livy describes it, occupying it. That's of tremendous value as we see what the vision of an ideal Roman community was. Now, the debate between scholars of urban planning of the ancient world is whether the city, that is Timgad, is designed based on a civilian or military plan. That is, whether it more closely resembles an army camp than a city. In this case, I think both sides, those who argue civilian and those who argue military, are correct. I think what we see here is a common design aesthetic in both forms of planning. They both, civilian and military, include a reliance on axiality and symmetry, the crucial public areas at the center, formalized entrances, and so on. Both reflect the Roman prioritizing of order, structure, and the centrality of authority in the community. So I don't think there's any need, actually, to have that debate about civilian versus military origins. I think they both are remarkably identical. Now, the city is laid out not just with a grid plan, but in a great square, about 1,154 feet or 355 meters on a side. The major roads, the Cardo Maximus, which is the name for the major north-south road in a Roman colony, and the Decumanus Maximus, which is the name for the major east-west road, divide the square of the city into quarters. These are subdivided into blocks, with the entire city measuring 12 blocks by 11. The Cardo, or the Cardo Maximus, is 585 feet, or 180 meters long, and 16 feet, about 5 meters wide, and lined with colonnades, as, well, were found at much earlier cities, the Greek cities, such as Ephesus and Miletus. These colonnades serve to set the major road, the Cardo Maximus or Decumanus Maximus, apart from those that flank it, emphasizing its importance because of the Roman desire to emphasize axiality. The Cardo terminates at the Forum, which measured about 160 by 140 feet or 50 by 43 meters. The Forum itself is part of a cluster of public buildings in the center of the community, which included shops, a basilica, that multi-purpose columned space for law courts and so on, a curia, which is the local council chambers, and a public latrine that sat 24. The Decumanus, unlike the Cardo, runs the length of the city from edge to edge. Now, the small blocks of Timgad mean that the colony is compact and designed to be walkable. Modern urban planners expect that people will not regularly walk more than 1,300 feet, or about 400 meters, for some amenity, such as a park. I think that's optimistic, but we'll just go with it. They're the experts. Interestingly, Timgad is just under that threshold. It seems that the Romans designed it so that all of the city's amenities were accessible by foot from virtually anywhere in the city. In addition, Roman traffic laws were designed to reduce congestion and noise so that no heavy wagons, those are the big wagons that were required to deliver bulk commodities of building stone or amphora or whatnot throughout the city, none of these were allowed on city streets during the day and were fully restricted from some areas altogether. Timgad seems to have been thoughtfully designed as a pedestrian city. Now, of the approximately 100 known original colonial houses at Timgad, that is, we have about 100 houses that have been studied from the founding of the colony in AD 100. What's interesting about these is they vary in design. Now, they're all the same size because the city is laid out in this grid, which means that every block of residential area is the same size, and those are all subdivided into identical sized houses. And that, I think, is likely to have been a deliberate attempt to reflect the identical status of the original colonist veterans. Of the houses themselves, we don't know who was responsible for their design, but they are essentially all different and could reflect decisions by the homeowners, not a central authority, because they don't show any evidence of modular planning. And in that way, they're very different. They're strong contrast to orthogonally planned cities that we've seen earlier, such as Kahun in Egypt or Olynthus in Greece. In each case there, we had orthogonal planning married with modular construction. Here at Timgad, that's not the case. The government planning or the orthogonal central planning doesn't go down to the level of house interiors, and that seems to be something that was left up to the homeowners. Well, within 100 years of its founding, the city of Timgad appears to have doubled or even tripled in population, and it grew substantially in size as well. The west gate of the city was removed, and large amounts of construction took place along the roads approaching the city on that side, as well as the suburban areas, that is, the areas immediately outside the city walls. This construction included a number of buildings, but most importantly, it included many new, large houses, referred to by the excavators as villas, about which the occupants of these more in a moment. All of this new construction did not conform to the orthogonal plan of the city, and instead was more organic, spreading along the roads or oriented to match the local topography, resulting in buildings set at a variety of directions and in very stark visual contrast to the original city. This abandonment of the original orthogonal planning might lead you to conclude that the people moving here in the suburbs are less Roman than the original colonists. Don't conclude that. If anything, in fact, they are more Roman than the original inhabitants, if such a thing were possible. The new arrivals seem to be trying to buy into the Roman system that they see working so well for others. A superb example of these individuals is Marcus Plautius Faustus, known locally and almost ubiquitously by his nickname Sertius. When everyone in town knows your nickname, you're a big fish, in whatever size the pond is. Sertius owned and lived in one of these new suburban houses right on the edge of town. He seemed to have made his money in real estate, so he did not come from the hereditary aristocracy. He's not a Roman patrician or a member of the Senate or any of the traditional elites. He's of the Nouvelle Riche. To secure his status in the community, he makes a series of large public dedications, being certain, of course, to have his name inscribed on each of these as the donor. So we know his civic and cultural profile. He paid, for example, for the new Western Market outside the gate and for the massive Capitolium complex, two forms of urban beneficence that are exactly as we would see in Rome. It's a textbook example of how Romans acquire and retain social status in a city. Now, the colony's religious identity is remarkable, so let's remark on it. The architecture and the inscriptions on the buildings and dedications from the site reveal quite a bit about the religious identity of its residents. The largest religious complex ever discovered in Roman North Africa was excavated at Timgad. In this religious sanctuary complex, we find sanctuary space to Serapis, a Greco-Roman god of grain. That is actually the Greek god whose worship was created in Alexandria under the Ptolemies and exported out to the Roman world as the god of grain and particularly of the grain trade. Asclepius, a Greek god of healing, and an interesting figure named Dea Africa. Literally, it means the goddess Africa, a figure who personifies the province herself. This is of a type of figure that the Romans do fairly commonly, and that is a personification. The Romans like to make personifications of a variety of types, including abstract qualities such as concordia or victory or virtus, the Roman quality of manliness. They also like to make personifications of geographical areas. Italia, Roma. These were both goddesses who had statues in Rome and were worshipped. So Dea Africa seems to be a continuation of that trend. So what we have in this largest ever found African sanctuary is an Egyptian or a Greco-Egyptian deity, a Greek deity, and a Roman deity, Africa herself. And they're all worshipped in this one space. 2 statues found at the site were dedicated to the goddess Victoria Parthica. Again, a personification. This is the personification of victory in Parthia. Parthia meaning that very successful war that this unit fought prior to discharge. Someone here is honoring their past achievements. Other dedications were made to the emperors and empresses, to Silvanus, who's an Italian god of woods and fields, to Bacchus, Hercules, Saturn, and so forth. Pretty much the traditional deities. Among these, all of these dedications, is Timgad's Capitolium, a temple for the worship of the Capitoline triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, paid for by Curtius. It was constructed outside the city, not at the head of the forum where we see it in previous Roman colonies such as Ostia, Cumae, Pompeii, and Paestum, to name but a few. At Timgad, on the other hand, its position actually reflects better that of the original Capitolium in Rome, on a high point outside the forum. The temple's sanctuary for the worship of the Capitoline triad was larger than the area of Timgad's forum itself. The temple podium was tall, requiring 28 steps to get up. And the temple's columns were originally 45 feet or 14 meters high. To give you some comparison, the columns on the Parthenon, that tremendously large temple of Athena at Athens, those columns are only 34 feet tall. So these are almost half again as large. It's really an extraordinarily large temple. Well, those are all the deities, and mainly the major deities who we know are worshipped here. So we need to ask ourselves, what's missing from this religious assemblage or this collection of sanctuaries? What's missing is an interesting collection of deities. Mithras, the Persian god, Isis from Egypt, Judaism, the worship of Magna Mater from Turkey, among others. In fact, all of the mystery religions, that is, those exclusive cults that promised life after death, and all of the foreign cults that you see contemporarily in Ostia, with the exception of Serapis, who does make an appearance, all of these are gone. None of them are here. The form and subjects of worship are, to borrow a phrase from John Ward Perkins, quote, aggressively Roman. It's as though all foreign deities who would flow into other Roman communities are not welcome here. It's a very Roman projection of religious identity, very traditional. Well, over 2,500 inscriptions have been found at Timgad, and these Latin inscriptions argue for a need on the part of the inhabitants here to proclaim a special connection to Roman culture. One of the most striking examples of the aggressive Romanness of the citizens of Timgad is a dedication of a statue of Mars, the Roman god of war, who is called in the dedication Conservator Aug, that is, the savior of the emperor. In 3 Latin words, Mars, Conservator Aug, the dedicator manages to include Mars, the god of war and father of all the Romans, and the emperor in this one dedication. Given that the dedication was almost certainly set up by an Army veteran, this seems appropriate. But I think it's notable that what we have here is, in fact, a dedication which emphasizes two of the major authorities in the Roman world, Mars and the Emperor. Now, I've discussed the layout of the colony, but I also want to point out the distribution of buildings within it. The public buildings inside the colony, the original ones, cluster in the center at the crossing of the Cardo Maximus and Decumanus Maximus, and then spread out along those two roads from there. That is, except for the bath complexes, which were scattered into the various blocks as neighborhood facilities. Again, I think the planners considered the pedestrian nature of the community in this regard and moved these throughout the community. When the Romans founded a colony, they were essentially imposing Roman culture onto an area and on a new community through buildings that required one to acknowledge the power of the government. The public buildings, notably the theater at Timgad, make that point. The theater seats about 3,500 people in 3 tiers, almost exactly the population of the original city. The lowest tier, that is the first 3 rows near the stage, consisted not of seats, but of low, broad steps, as you might have in a modern theater if you removed 3 rows of seats. These steps were left there deliberately to allow room for the chairs of magistrates and members of the city council. These chairs would be carried in by slaves so that these local elites could sit in comfort, essentially filling the first 3 rows with armchairs. A balustrade, or a solid barrier, separates them physically from the second tier of seats, which were restricted to the middle class, the equestrian class, and another balustrade separates those from the upper tier of seats for the lowest class, the plebeians. Sitting in the theater, therefore, required one to accept his or her place in society in a very clear fashion. You are, by taking your seat in this theater, literally taking your place in the Roman world. And it forces you to acknowledge where you are and to see the authorities of your government down there in the front row. And I think that's a powerful message to people. Well, in addition to the theater, Timgad demonstrates the imposition of Roman culture in its 14 bath complexes. I've made the point before that we use this term bath complex, and it's unfortunate, but it's stuck, and I can't do anything about that. But what we really have here are remarkable sort of mini spas, where people could come and spend hours a day bathing in rooms of hot, warm, or cold water, saunas from dry to steam, all sorts of spaces for ball games and exercise, wrestling and things like that, and also rooms for lectures or to hear music or poetry readings. People would come here and just lounge all day. And so these are really important complexes for the individuals in the community, and they're very Roman, recognizably Roman. Here at Timgad, we have 14 of these scattered throughout the community. This is an extraordinarily large number. Think about it. 14 bath complexes for what we think is eventually 10,000 people. By contrast, we know of only 9 large bath complexes found at the contemporary Ostia with its population of about 50,000. And so this is really an extraordinary number. And by even greater contrast, if you think about Timgad's initial population of 3,000, this is really remarkable. Somebody here is very concerned about projecting Roman identity and the benefits of Roman rule. Well, the baths at Timgad included the large northern baths. This was a 40-room complex whose size and design seemed directly based on the large imperial baths in Rome, with its symmetrically arranged pairs of rooms. And it's like one of the Roman imperial baths, that is, a bath dedicated by an emperor. Another one of these baths in the northwest corner of the city was the meeting place of the Philadelphii. This is a group called the Society of the Philadelphii, the Society of Brotherly Love, which is what Philadelphia means. many of whose members gave back to the city with public monuments and put that association, as the Society of the Philadelphia, on the monuments next to their names. This group included a next-door neighbor of Curtius's, Publius Flavius Pudens Pomponianus, known to his friends as Vocantius, who seems to have come from an established senatorial family. Vocantius dedicated a series of statues in the city. Now, his modest benefaction, in contrast to Curtius, may indicate his relative social security in the community and in the larger Roman world. That is, he doesn't need to establish or retain his social ranking because it's already there as being a member of the senatorial class. In terms of imposing culture, the public library along the Cardo provides additional evidence and is, as well, one of the best preserved libraries in the Roman world. Paid for by another wealthy local, Marcus Julius Quintianus Flavius Rogatianus, the library is one of the largest public buildings in the city. It measures 25 by 23 meters, and it's calculated that it held 3,000 scrolls, making it comparable to one of the libraries in the contemporary Forum of Trajan. In spite of all we've been able to learn about Timgad, the city as seen today preserves only the stone foundations and streets for reasons we'll discuss shortly. Still, that the entire city was made out of cut stone and not mud brick demonstrates the Roman thoroughness in establishing a colony here on the edges of their territory. The largest standing monument in the city is the Arch of Trajan. The Arch of Trajan is a triple passage arch, that is, it has 3 passageways through it, a large central one and 2 smaller ones on the sides, that is in size and proportions very close to Trajan's arch at Beneventum in central Italy, and almost identical to the slightly later Arch of Septimius Severus in the Forum at Rome. It's a purely Roman building form, at home really in the Forum Romanum of Rome itself, but here transported to the frontier. And it's decorated with Roman sculpture, including statues of Mars, the god of war, and Concordia, the personification of harmony between the Roman classes. I think it's interesting that between these 2 sculptures, they establish the Roman notions of ideal relationships, both within and outside the community. That is, Roman foreign and domestic relations here, war and harmony within the community. Well, the development of the colony at Timgad shows that as of the 2nd century AD, the Roman pattern of urbanization was still spreading and still successful. Timgad shows a Roman city on the edge of Roman territory that is remarkably aggressively Roman in design and culture. Laid out as the ideal form of Rome itself, the city shows how eagerly every aspect of that design was adopted by the local inhabitants. From baths to temples to theater and library, the people of Timgad reveled in their Romanitas. The city survived for only, as these things go, a short period of time. In AD 430, it was sacked during the Vandal invasion of Africa and badly damaged, finally destroyed during the Muslim conquest of the 8th century. Now, our final Roman city will show a different side of urban life, one in which the inhabitants created a more mixed ethnic identity, this time in the grain-growing region of Egypt.